So then I said, no, I meant the other Jeff.
Classic.
Oh, hey, by the way, I actually got something in the mail today. I got one of those Raspberry computers you're always going on about.
Oh, nice. Which one, the Pi 5 or Pi 4?
I think it's the 24?
24?
Yeah, it's got like 4 gigs of RAM, a few hard drives, an i7, I think.
Wait, an i7? Are you sure you bought a Raspberry Pi?
Wait, what the heck is a Pi? I'm gonna have to call you back. Okay, so this is clearly not a Raspberry Pi, and fortunately I didn't actually think that when I bought it either. This is instead a Raspberry NVR, specifically the Raz M Pro 24 i7 4T. This system was designed to be an all-in-one NVR solution for surveillance setups. So it has compute and storage capabilities to process and store all the feeds from your cameras, but it also has built-in networking to allow you to connect all of your PoE cameras directly to this unit, hence all of these ports on the back. I've never covered anything quite like this before, and I was really curious to see what all you might be able to do with something like this. I mean, with how interesting and weird it seemed, I just couldn't help myself. And oddly enough, the more I dug into the system, the weirder it got, but I'm getting ahead of myself. I originally came across one of these systems on Facebook Marketplace, but the seller was asking for like $500 or something ridiculous like that. And luckily later on, I came across an eBay listing and picked this one up for just $82, including tax and shipping. I tried researching this unit a bit before it came in, but documentation is pretty limited. The Raspberry Technologies brand was acquired back in 2020 and seemingly dissolved not long after that. While you can still access the old website thanks to Internet Archive, most of the documentation for this specific model seems to have been lost. Some documentation on very similar models exists though, and I was at least able to also find this basic product summary. Here you can see, as the model name kind of suggests, that we should be expecting an i7 3770 and 4 terabytes of storage. And something else I noticed was that this unit actually ships with Windows embedded. The fact that this appliance didn't come with some extremely proprietary software made me feel pretty confident that we'd be able to install whatever we want and find a good way to put this little guy to use. Little guy. Now, another thing I feel confident about is the reliability of my VPN service thanks to Private Internet Access, the sponsor of today's video. As I'm sure many of you guys know, a VPN is a really helpful tool to have in your tech tool belt. It can help keep your internet traffic private, so for example, your ISP can't throttle connections to certain services or domains. And it's also really handy to have when you need to access websites or content that aren't available in your region. And yeah, I know many of you guys, like me, probably run your own VPN servers, but PIA works really well as a backup and also gives you access to tons of servers across 91 different countries. I love that I can use PIA on all of my devices, from my phone to my laptop running Fedora, and even on servers in my home lab. In fact, one of my favorite ways to put PIA to use is by setting it up as a VPN for a Docker container called Gluten. This lets you easily and automatically tunnel a bunch of other containers directly through PIA's servers. I've been running that specific setup for like 2 years now, and I haven't had a single issue with PIA. And I also like that they have a very strict no logs policy that's been verified by multiple third-party audits. So if you're looking for a reliable, affordable, and feature-rich VPN, maybe go check out PIA by using my link down in the description. That'll get you 83% off, plus an extra 4 months for free. On the front of this system, you get 2 USB 2 and 2 USB 3 Type A ports. Aside from that, there's just a lot of indicator LEDs and a reset button. On the back, you get a VGA and HDMI port, as well as an 1/8" audio jack, an eSATA port, 2 more USB 2 ports, an RS-232 serial connector, and then a bunch of network connections. There are 2 1GB Ethernet ports, although one of them is actually a combo jack that can either use an RJ45 or SFP connector. However, you can't use both at the same time. Then you get these other 24 Ethernet ports, but since these are specifically just for connecting to cameras, they're limited to just 100 megabits per second. However, they also do provide power over Ethernet, and I'll talk a lot more about these ports here soon. After removing these 2 stickers on the front that were annoying me, I took the top cover off to take a look inside. And boy, is there a lot going on here. Right off the bat, I noticed the 4 drive bays in the front, 2 of which were populated with 2 terabyte hard drives. There's also another 500GB 2.5" hard drive, which I presume would have been for the operating system. The whole system is powered from this 420 watt power supply, which is definitely not a standard model. It is common these days to have power supplies that only provide 12 volts, but this guy also has a 53 volt rail. That's what these purple and white wires are for, and I'm pretty sure this 53 volts is just for the PoE ports. I couldn't see any RAM sockets, so I figured those, as well as the CPU, would be under this big heatsink. Looking a bit closer, I also noticed a PCIe by one slot, but, well, it's in a rather awkward spot, tucked between the CPU heatsink and the side of the case, so I'm not sure how useful that will really be in a 1U chassis. I also noticed quite a few buttons and dip switches scattered around the board, but, well, aside from these 4 that were labeled, I didn't immediately know what any of them did. There also appeared to be another SATA port or something, but it was tucked away to where I really couldn't see what it was for. Before digging any further, I wanted to make sure the system actually worked. So I hooked up an HDMI cable and power, and without pressing the power button, the system just turned on by itself. Which kind of makes sense because, well, there isn't an external power button at all. There's just this power button on the inside that's mostly covered up by a SATA cable. Fortunately, I got a nice little splash screen and then landed in the UEFI menu. And here there were lots of options available, but I mostly just wanted to make sure everything was as it should be. I confirmed that I had an i7-3770, as well as just 4GB of RAM, and I could also see the 500GB hard drive, but only one of the 2TB drives was showing up. Oh, and I also noticed that SATA ports 2 and 3 were oddly just missing entirely. I went ahead and booted into an Ubuntu Live image to investigate a bit more, and started by running LSPCI. With all 26 or 27 of these network ports on the back, I was a bit surprised to only see 2 network controllers were available, one of them Intel and one Realtek. There were also 2 SATA controllers as well, however, still only one of those 2TB drives was showing up. But the system seemed to be working, so I decided to explore a bit further. I started by taking out the 2 3.5-inch drives, which actually was a little bit tricky because of how these USB cables were. I tried unplugging them, but they were glued in place, and I actually almost destroyed the USB 3 header. I eventually got them out, and then also removed the power supply, the 2.5-inch drive tray, and then finally the heatsink, which revealed something I did not expect. There isn't actually a CPU socket on this board, or RAM sockets. Instead, there's just these little mezzanine connectors of some type that connect to, well, essentially a little single board computer that contains the CPU, RAM, chipset, and even the BIOS chip. Now, I've actually come across something pretty similar to this in a different video where I looked at this industrial PC quite a while back, but this was a different design, and as far as I'm aware, this board isn't following any type of standard, which, if that's true, it's kind of a shame because it would be cool if you could just like take this and just stick it into a different system and have a different form factor and different IO, but I can only dream. Anyway, with that big heatsink off and everything else out of the way, I could finally get a better look at a few more things on this board. First of all, I found out why SATA ports 2 and 3 weren't showing up. That's because, well, they just aren't populated at all. I also found this slot here, which, well, actually, I still don't know what this is. It's just labeled Con 5, and I could never figure out what it was actually for. If you know, please leave a comment down below because I am very curious. Lastly, I finally realized what that little SATA port thing was that I saw. It turns out the 4 hard drive bays connect to a completely separate board that connects to the main board via this one SATA port here. I don't know why it took me so long to notice that, but I was a bit bummed out once I did. I was hoping that with 4 3.5-inch drive bays, the system could potentially be used as like a NAS or something else where having that many drives might be useful. Sadly though, this just probably isn't going to be the case because, well, this uses a hardware RAID controller. Essentially, this little board here has a little controller on it that can create and handle a RAID array, and then it just connects to the main system via that single SATA connection. In fact, with the system torn down like this, I could see some silk screening for these little dip switches here, which can be used to set what type of RAID array you want. But I'll talk a bit more about that once I start testing out the system here in a bit. Since I already had the little compute board out, I decided to upgrade the RAM. Unfortunately, I only had an 8GB DDR3L SODIMM kit, so it wasn't a huge upgrade, but at least now I should be able to take advantage of dual channel memory. I also replaced the 2.5-inch hard drive with a SATA SSD, and then installed Debian 13. Now, the thing I was probably most curious about with the system was all of the networking. With only those 2 network controllers, I was a bit confused, like, where did all those other ports come into play? And after tinkering a bit, I finally figured it out. And really, I should have been able to figure this out even with the limited documentation I had, and even the front panel was a pretty clear indicator. Basically, the U2 or uplink 2 port is the Realtek NIC, and this is just like any other gigabit NIC on a computer. The U1 port is a bit different though, and not just because you have the option of either RJ45 or SFP. Really, I think the best way to explain this is that Well, this isn't a computer with a bunch of network interfaces. It's more like a 24-port PoE switch that just so happens to have a computer connected to it. In fact, you can actually shut down the computer entirely, and the switch component of the system still stays running. That U1 combo interface is actually connected to the same switch that all of the 100 megabit PoE ports are connected to, and then basically that Intel NIC that we saw earlier is also connected to that switch. I was able to confirm this by connecting a system to one of those 100 megabit ports, and even with nothing plugged into the U1 port, my other test system and the Raspberry system could be connected and communicate over the network. I also didn't notice until I was writing the final script for this video that the switch on this is actually managed. So I had to come back, and I was able to log into the UI at 192.168.50.1 with the username and password of admin and system respectively. There aren't a ton of features here, just most of the basic layer 2 functions you would expect like VLANs, as well as a DHCP server, which, well, that would have come in handy later on had I known it existed. But yeah, basically this is a managed PoE switch with a computer just strapped to it, which I find to be quite interesting. Now, to try and get an idea of how this system stacks up in terms of CPU performance, I ran Geekbench 6, where it managed to not finish the benchmark at all because it just kept crashing. I tried reinstalling Geekbench, I reinstalled the operating system, I swapped the original memory back in case one of my sticks were bad or something, but, well, it just kept crashing. Now, outside of my early FX 6300 days when I was first building computers, I haven't really ever had that many issues with CPU stability. But regardless, I swapped out the 3770 with an i5 3470. And wouldn't you know it, the benchmark ran just fine. So I swapped the i7 3770 back in, thinking it might have just been a seeding issue or something, but, well, it crashed again. So I went into the BIOS and disabled Turbo Boost on the i7, and after that I was finally able to finish a Geekbench run. So maybe it was a bad CPU or an issue with the VRMs or something, I'm not really sure, but I at least finally got Geekbench 6 scores of 671 for single core and 2087 for multi-core. Now, with Turbo disabled on the i7, the i5 was arguably a better option. Neither of these are really that impressive when compared to a low-powered modern CPU like the N100, for example, that's in this Link Plus N2, but still, these scores aren't terrible, and there's probably enough CPU horsepower here to run a handful of different self-hosting workloads. But I don't know if you would really want to because, well, the power draw here isn't great. When just sitting idle in Debian after running PowerTop AutoTune and the Auto ASPM script to try and minimize power draw, the system was still pulling over 40 watts from the wall. And interestingly, the computer portion of the system wasn't really the culprit. If you shut down the computer and just leave the switch running, it was still drawing around 24 watts without any PoE devices attached. Fortunately, the cooling solution at least seemed to work pretty well, keeping CPU temperatures in check even when running a stress test, but the fan noise was less than ideal. It really wasn't that bad under load, you weren't getting like crazy 1U server jet engine sounds. But at idle, the system was very much audible. If I were actually using the system, I definitely wouldn't want it near me, I would want it in a separate server room or something. To test out the PCIe slot, I used a PCIe riser, and then just plugged in an NVMe adapter with an SSD for a quick test. Unfortunately, I found that this only supports PCIe Gen 2, which with just that one lane means you would have less than 10 gigabits of bandwidth. That being said, I'm not sure how useful this awkwardly placed slot in a 1U case would be anyway, so it's probably not that big of a deal. Alright, back to the hard drives. I already mentioned that this RAID controller was going to be a bit of a bummer, and that's for a few reasons. First of all, your bandwidth is going to be limited to just that of a single SATA port, but also this means you aren't able to run things like ZFS where the operating system needs a direct access to the disks. Some controllers can use something called port multiplication to present each drive individually, and actually was able to get that running with this other weird SATA adapter I covered in a different video, but port multiplication comes with its own set of issues, which doesn't really matter because this controller doesn't support that anyway. You can select from a few different RAID options like RAID 0, 1, 10, 5, and even RAID 3, which you don't really see that often. And then you can also select JBOD large, which just presents all of the disks to the operating system as one large logical volume. It was a bit finicky trying to get the dip switches to work properly. I even thought maybe one of the 2 terabyte drives were bad, and so I swapped in some other 4 terabyte drives, but eventually I just figured out that the labeling on this wasn't very clear. In fact, it was kind of just wrong. You actually have to have the 4th switch high to set any of the RAID modes, even though it doesn't show you that. But anyway, I was able to get those two 4TB drives set up in a RAID 1 array, which seemed to work just fine. But one of the other problems with hardware RAID is that when compared to software RAID options, it's not very easy to get alerts when a drive failure occurs. Out of curiosity to see what would happen, I tested by just removing one drive, and I got this response. And no, I couldn't find a way to turn the beeping off. It seems like it only stops when you actually fix the issue. Which, even that is a bit tricky since there isn't any visual indicator as to which drive failed. There's not like an LED or anything. Now, to be fair, I am a complete noob when it comes to hardware RAID. I've always just dealt with things like ZFS or MD80M, so it's very likely that I'm just missing something obvious here, so if so, let me know. Between the high power draw, lack of expandability, and the hardware RAID, it's tough to see this system being all that useful in any sort of home lab environment. Well, unless you did the obvious thing and actually used this as an NVR. I mean, if you want to run a bunch of PoE cameras, you're already going to need a PoE switch, so the extra power draw from the system really becomes less of an issue. Plus, you're probably going to want to run all of those cameras on an isolated network, which, well, this kind of just does out of the box. The hard drive situation is still a bit annoying, but even just throwing a single large capacity drive in here or something might work fine as long as you have a backup. And you could, maybe even with the right adapter, connect something like a Halo 8 to the PCIe slot for some machine vision capabilities. Although with the one lane of PCIe Gen 2, that might be a bottleneck, I'm not really sure. But anyway, I decided to try setting this system up as an NVR. For the software, I went with Frigate, which is what I use for my actual NVR here at home, as I covered in a recent video. I already had Debian running, so getting Frigate installed was as simple as installing Docker and then setting up a Docker Compose file. I also created and mounted a file system on that 4TB RAID array for some storage. Now, for a test camera, I just picked up this really cheap, crappy model that's, I think, a knockoff of a Dahua camera. I'm not really sure. It works. So I hooked it up to the switch, and PoE seemed to be working, but at this point, I didn't have a DHCP server. Now, had I known that this switch had a built-in DHCP server, I would have just enabled that and saved a lot of time, but instead I tried doing something I haven't done before, which is setting up a DHCP server in Debian. It took a bit of trial and error, but eventually I was able to get a DHCP server up and running using something called Kia. By default, DHCP is disabled on this camera, so I had to log into the web UI and configure it to use DHCP. However, it just didn't want to do that at all, and so I ended up just having to set up a static IP anyway, so the whole DHCP thing was a waste of time. Whatever, the camera powered on, and I was able to get it connected and added to Frigate. Now, I didn't think the integrated graphics in that i7-3770 were going to be all that useful, but as it turns out, I was still able to configure hardware acceleration using VA API, and as long as I was using H.264, FFmpeg could leverage those integrated graphics for video playback. There was no way though that I was going to use that old i7 for any AI inference, so I just set it up to record 24/7 rather than doing any object detection, but with that it seemed to be working just fine. The CPU load was fairly low thanks to hardware acceleration, streaming and playback worked just fine, and well, the system was drawing like almost 80 watts all the time, but hey, still, it was working. There are plenty of much better solutions out there if you're needing a DIY NVR, especially if you're looking for something that's efficient. If that's actually something you're interested in, maybe check out this video that Jeff Geerling did on this little Pi NVR. Also, just big shout out to Jeff for helping me with that very, very dumb intro. If you're looking for anything other than inefficient, simple NVR, this probably isn't going to be all that useful unless, I don't know, maybe you have some very niche automation use case or something where you need a bunch of devices connected over 10 or 100 megabit. I don't know, if you think you have some cool use cases for this, put them down below, I'd love to hear them. What I do know is that this was a very fun system to just take a look at, so maybe if you have a YouTube channel and also make videos about weird old computers, this could be a great find. Otherwise though, I would say just stick to Raspberry Pis and leave this old Raspberry be. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this video. If so, maybe consider giving me a like or subscribing to see more, or maybe even becoming a RAID member for as little as $1 a month. With that, you get all of my videos without any ads, plus early access, which I think is a pretty good deal. That's about it for this one though, so as always, thank you guys so much for watching, stay curious, and I can't wait to see you in the next one.
Okay. Thanks for this call, it was very enlightening.